Welcome back to the Work Over Well, and in today's video we're going to be covering some of the more standout units in the Sylvaneth roster. The Kurnoth Hunters and their 3 weapon variants, as well as the Arch-Revenant. Now I included the Arch-Revenant on this list because I believe the Arch-Revenant is incredibly synergistic with Kurnoth Hunters and should be auto-include if you plan to run a Kurnoth Hunter heavy list. So without further ado, let's get started. First up is the Kurnoth Hunters with Great Swords. These guys come in at 224 points for 3 models, and they have a stat line of 5-inch move, 7 bravery, 5 wounds, and a 4-up save. Their Kurnoth Greatsword is pretty good at 1-inch reach, 4 attacks, 4s to hit, 3s to wound, 1 rend, 2 damage. For unique abilities, the leader of the unit gets +1 to hit. They have a ability conduit, or command ability conduit. So how this works is whenever your heroes use a command ability, if it's an aura or if it requires a range, Kurnoth Hunters, regardless of where they are on the map, they kind of broadcast that buff or that command ability for units wholly within 12 inches of them. So you can kind of extend the reach of your command abilities with Kurnoth Hunters, or if it's a single target command ability, you can select a unit wholly within 12 of a Kurnoth Hunter. So it's a great tool to extend your command abilities. And that these first 2 unique abilities are common for each weapon variant. All of them have the leader gets +1, all of them have the command ability conduit. Additionally, all Kurnoth Hunters have the ability to where they can forego movement and pile in the charge phase to get a +1 save. So if they kind of like root themselves into the ground and kind of bulk up to absorb the incoming charge. And additionally, at the end of the combat phase, roll a dice for each hunter within 1 inch of an enemy model. And on a 4+, you deal a mortal wound. So just kind of a little extra chip damage. So those 4 abilities are common throughout all Kurnoth Hunters. But the Kurnoth Hunters with Greatswords have a unique kind of additional damage ability where 6s to wound deal 1 mortal wound in addition to the regular damage. So Kurnoth Hunters with Greatswords are an elite tanky infantry. They're very difficult to remove and they do a fair amount of damage. Out of the 3 weapon variants, I think the Greatswords is probably the weakest of the 3, but that in no way means that they're bad. Kurnoth Hunters with Greatswords are really powerful and really strong. I just think that scythes are better for the melee variant. And as when we go over them, you'll see why. But for what they do, they are great. I think that having a unit of swords just kind of sparsed around in your unit or in your army cannot go wrong. If you buff them up with an Arch-Revenant, they can potentially do more consistent damage than a scythe unit, but I think that the difference isn't all that bad. I think that you're best off going with scythes. If you want to use those great swords, though, I would use them in minimum squad sizes of 3, and they work best as an auxiliary or a supporting unit with your other battle line to kind of hold the line. Next up, we have the Kurnoth Hunters with great scythes. They come in at 215 points, and they have the same stat line as all Kurnoth Hunters, the same abilities that all Kurnoth Hunters have that we previously went over: the +1 to hit, the conduit ability, the +1 to save if you don't move or pile in, and then the end of combat chip damage. The only thing that really changes here is the weapon profile. And what a weapon profile it is. The Kurnoth Great Scythe is really powerful. It has 2-inch reach, 3 attacks, 3s to hit, 3s to wound, 2 rend, D3 damage. I think that these guys and their weapon profile is just better in all regards to the Greatsword. The losing 1 attack per model and the potential of more consistent damage does not outweigh the higher accuracy of the +3 to hit, the longer range, and the more rend. This is just a beefcake of a melee profile. As I've said in a lot of my videos, Rend is king in 3rd edition Age of Sigmar, so having that 2 Rend is very powerful. And if you buff them up with a Kurnoth Hunter, no, excuse me, not a Kurnoth Hunter, a Arch-Revenant, which we'll go over at the end of this video, they can hurt, especially if you get them in larger unit sizes, which the 2-inch range lets them do. So these are your elite, tanky, damage-dealing infantry. They are difficult to remove, and they do a large amount of damage. The Great Scythe Kurnoth Hunters are currently the best variant. I personally do not see any reason to not take them over the sword variant. I just think they're better. But I can definitely see a reason that the sword variant exists. They are more consistent in the amount of damage they do, and you can calculate for that appropriately. And they're a little bit easier to move. Swords are easier to maneuver in smaller squad sizes, but great scythes can take in any squad sizes because of their 2-inch reach flexibility. The last of the Kurnoth Hunter variants is the Kurnoth with Great Bow. They come in at 225 points, and they occupy a sort of unique position in the Sylvaneth roster. They have a little bit of a niche usage, but that does not mean they're bad. They're just a little bit different. They have the same stat line as all the other Kurnoth Hunters, and they have the same unique abilities. What sets them apart is their really interesting missile profile, the Kurnoth Hunter Great Bow. So it's 30-inch reach, 2 attacks, force to hit, 3s to wound, 1 rend, d3 damage. And then they have a melee profile, just kind of a token melee profile with vicious claws, 1-inch reach, 3 attacks, force to hit, and that should be force to wound. That was my bad on the typo. 0 rend and 1 damage. So how do you use Kurnoth Hunters with Great Bow? I would class them as more of an artillery piece than anything else. That 30-inch reach is huge. You can cover a majority of the board with that, especially if you just kind of keep them safe on a back objective and you can just plink off at whatever you need to. They're not the most accurate things, and with only 2 attacks each, they're a little bit on the weaker side in terms of offensive power, but for what they do, it's not that bad. So, as I previously said, these are the closest thing to an artillery unit that Sylvaneth have. And something else to note, just kind of in more recent developments with Sylvaneth, is before, Kurnoth Hunters with Great Bow were pretty bad because the Wildwoods, something that is so necessary for the success of Sylvaneth, blocked the line of sight of Great Bows. That is no longer the case. You can shoot through your own woods, which is phenomenal. It really improves their capabilities, and it makes them actually viable. So Kurnoth Hunters with Great Bows are great for plinking off key targets, and they are useful, but not necessarily an auto include. I really like Great Bows because they give me a little bit of ranged threat to let me do damage in most phases of the game, as well as just to hurt key points in the enemy's forces when I need to. And I also just enjoy the way they look. They're a good defensive wall too. So what I tend to do is I will put my Kurnoth Hunters in the back line to help screen for deep strike or to sit near a branch wraith to defend the branch wraith while the branch wraith summons dryads to fill out my ranks. The Great Bows can sit in any squad size. Minimum is generally the better one just because for the points invested, you're better off going with Great Scythes. Last but not least is the Arch-Revenant. This is a Sylvaneth hero costing 105 points. Has a pretty interesting stat line of 12-inch move, 8 bravery, 5 wounds, and a 4-up save. She has 2 melee profiles, the Revenant's Glaive, 2-inch reach, 3 attacks, 3s to hit, 3s to wound, 2 rend, 2 damage. And then the Zephyr Spite Tail Pincer. So if you don't know, the wings on this model are actually a part of a bug, a little Zephyr Spite. And the little bug can like nip at things with its tail. It's pretty cool, I think. The Tail Pincer has a 1-inch reach, 1 attack, 4s to hit, 3s to wound, no rend, d3 damage. Her command ability is fantastic, especially for Kurnoth heavy lists, because you can give a unit +1 attack in the combat phase if they're wholly within 9 inches, or 12 if the Arch-Revenant is your general. For unique abilities, she gives a reroll 1s to hit for all Kurnoth Hunters wholly within 12. She can choose to use her shield to defend or steady her spear, which lets her reroll 1s to hit or save in the combat phase. And her little bug thing that's kind of a symbiote of her can negate 1 wound for her per game, which I think is really flavorful. So the bug will kind of jump in the way of an attack to protect the Arch-Revenant. But in the process, you lose flight and the tail pincer weapon profile. So I absolutely love the Arch-Revenant. I think it's one of my more favorite models in the game, just in terms of the appearance of it and the usage of it. It is a good force multiplier for Kurnoth Hunter lists. The command ability is awesome, and the mobility and versatility of the Arch-Revenant is amazing. And for their points cost, I think they're really cheap. They are great to have around your front line to augment your unit's killing power, and you can kind of have them skirt around to wherever you need them. So like if you need to send the hero off to secure an objective or generally move around the battlefield, you're not going to have a problem with that because of the 12-inch move and fly. So that was it for the Kurnoth Hunters and the Arch-Revenant. These guys are really powerful, especially in combination. Currently, if I remember my data correctly, Kurnoth Hunter spam is kind of the meta for Sylvaneth. I personally don't own enough Kurnoth Hunters to do a really heavy Kurnoth Hunter list, but like at top tournaments, you see a lot of Kurnoth Hunters. And that's kind of how they were for most of second edition, but with third edition still kind of being fleshed out, you have other options with Sylvaneth being a little bit more forgiving and not always having to take as many Kurnoth Hunters as points would allow. But I hope you enjoyed this video. I always enjoy talking about Sylvaneth. They are my personally favorite faction. They are the one that I have invested the most time and money into. And I hopefully one day, maybe if we get to say 500 subscribers or maybe 1,000 subscribers, I'll do a showcase of my army and I'll show you what I've painted up and kind of what I own personally. I think that'd be a fun little milestone to try and shoot for. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like or a comment. And if you like this type of content, consider subscribing. This has been the Wargrove of Woe, and I'll talk to you all next time.